The sun was setting over the small, dusty town of Red Creek, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The town was a forgotten relic of the past, a place where time seemed to stand still. The streets were lined with weathered buildings, their paint peeling and windows cracked. The only sound that broke the silence was the occasional hum of an old pickup truck rumbling down the main road. It was a place where nothing ever happened. Until tonight. Jake Thompson was a man of routine. Every day, he would wake up at the crack of dawn, brew a pot of strong coffee, and head out to his garage. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the mechanical world of engines, gears, and wires. Jake was the best mechanic in Red Creek, and probably the entire county. He had a knack for fixing things that others had given up on, and his reputation had earned him a steady stream of customers, even in a town as small as this. But tonight, something was different. As Jake sat in his garage, tinkering with an old carburetor, he heard a strange noise outside. It was a low, rumbling sound like thunder, but it was coming from the sky. He stepped outside, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag, and looked up. The sky was clear, with not a cloud in sight, but the sound was growing louder. Suddenly, a bright light streaked across the sky, followed by a deafening crash that shook the ground beneath his feet. Jake's heart raced as he grabbed a flashlight and ran towards the source of the crash. It wasn't far, just beyond the edge of town, in the middle of the desert. As he approached, he could see a large, smoking crater in the ground. In the center of the crater was a strange, metallic object, unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was sleek and silver, with smooth, curved edges that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. It was a ship, but not one made by human hands. Jake's curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously approached the ship. As he got closer, he noticed a crack in the hull, and a faint, bluish light emanating from within. He shone his flashlight inside, and his breath caught in his throat. There, lying on the floor of the ship, was a figure. It was humanoid, but unlike any human he had ever seen. The figure was tall and slender, with skin that glowed faintly in the dark. Its hair was long and silvery, flowing like liquid mercury, and its eyes, when they opened, were a deep, mesmerizing shade of violet. The alien, for that was what it had to be, looked up at Jake with a mixture of fear and hope. It spoke, but the words were in a language he couldn't understand. However, the tone was clear. It was pleading for help. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, the alien reached out a hand, and something inside him clicked. He couldn't just leave it here. "All right," Jake said, more to himself than to the alien. "Let's get you out of there." He carefully helped the alien out of the ship, surprised by how light it was. The alien leaned on him for support, its body trembling with exhaustion. As they made their way back to the garage, Jake couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. Who, or what, was this alien? And why had it crashed here, of all places? When they reached the garage, Jake set the alien down on a makeshift cot he kept for emergencies. He grabbed a first aid kit and began to tend to its wounds, which were superficial but still needed attention. As he worked, the alien watched him with those piercing violet eyes, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was studying him just as much as he was studying it. Finally, the alien spoke again, this time in a voice that was soft and melodic, yet filled with urgency. It pointed to the sky, then to itself, and then to Jake. It was clear that it wanted to go home, and it was asking for his help to get there. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was way above his pay grade, but as he looked into the alien's eyes, he knew he couldn't say no. There was something about it, something that made him feel like this was his destiny, like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "I'll help you. But you're going to have to tell me what the hell is going on." The alien smiled, a small, grateful smile, and Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change forever. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jake spent every waking moment trying to repair the alien ship, which was far more advanced than anything he had ever worked on before. The technology was unlike anything on Earth, with components that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But Jake was determined. He had always been a quick learner, and he was able to figure out the basics of how the ship worked, even if he didn't fully understand science behind it. The alien, who had introduced herself as Lyra, was a constant presence by his side. She was eager to help, pointing out components and explaining their functions in her strange, melodic language. Jake couldn't understand her words, but he could tell that she was incredibly intelligent, with a deep understanding of the ship's systems. Together, they made progress, slowly but surely. But it wasn't just the ship that was a challenge. Jake had to keep Lyra's presence a secret from the rest of the town. Red Creek was a small, tight-knit community, and news traveled fast. If anyone found out about Lyra, it would only be a matter of time before the government, or worse, got involved. So Jake kept her hidden in the garage, only venturing out at night to gather supplies. It wasn't easy. Jake was used to being alone, but having Lyra around was different. She was curious about everything, constantly asking questions, or at least, that's what Jake assumed she was doing, based on the way she pointed at things and made inquisitive noises. She was fascinated by the simplest things, like the way water flowed from a faucet, or the sound of a radio playing. Jake found himself enjoying her company, even if they couldn't communicate properly. But as the days went by, Jake began to notice something strange. Lyra's health seemed to be deteriorating. Her skin, which had once glowed with a soft, bluish light, was now dull and pale. She was growing weaker, and Jake could tell that she was in pain. He tried to ask her what was wrong, but without a common language, it was impossible to get a clear answer. Finally, one night, Lyra collapsed. Jake caught her just in time, lowering her gently to the ground. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were half closed. She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his chest, over his heart. Then she pointed to the sky, her eyes filled with desperation. Jake understood. She was running out of time. If they didn't get the ship repaired soon, she wouldn't make it. "I'm trying," Jake said, his voice filled with frustration. "But I don't know if I can do it in time." Lyra looked at him, her eyes pleading. Then she did something that surprised him. She reached up and touched his forehead with her fingertips. Suddenly, Jake felt a strange sensation, like a warm current flowing through his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, images of stars, planets, and galaxies. He saw Lyra's home, a beautiful, shimmering world filled with light and life. And then he saw something else, a dark, ominous force, threatening to destroy everything. The vision faded, and Jake found himself back in the garage, staring at Lyra in shock. She had just shown him her memories, her thoughts. It was a level of communication he had never experienced before, and it left him breathless. "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "I get it. You need to get home, and I'm going to help you no matter what it takes." Lyra smiled weakly, and Jake felt a surge of determination. He didn't know how, but he was going to fix that ship. He had to. But as he turned back to the ship, he heard a noise outside. It was the sound of footsteps approaching the garage. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. He quickly covered Lyra with a blanket and grabbed a wrench, just in case. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Sheriff Tom Harris, the town's lawman, and one of Jake's few friends. "Jake," Tom said, looking around the garage. "What the hell are you doing up at this hour?" Jake forced a smile, trying to act casual. "Just working on a project. You know how it is." Tom raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious. "At 3 in the morning. You've been acting strange lately, Jake. People are starting to talk." Jake's mind raced. He had to get Tom out of here before he discovered Lyra. "I'm fine, Tom. Just busy. You know how it is." Tom didn't look convinced, but he didn't push the issue. "All right, Jake. But if you need anything, you know where to find me." As Tom left, Jake let out a sigh of relief. But he knew that time was running out. If he didn't get the ship repaired soon, not only would Lyra die, but her secret, and his, would be exposed. The next few days were a blur of activity. Jake worked tirelessly on the ship, barely stopping to eat or sleep. Lyra's condition was worsening, and he could see the pain in her eyes every time she looked at him. He had to get her home, no matter what. But the ship was proving to be more of a challenge than he had anticipated. The damage was extensive, and some of the components were beyond his ability to repair. He needed parts, specialized parts that didn't exist on Earth. He was at a loss, unsure of what to do next. Then, one night, as he was poring over the ship's schematics, he had an idea. It was risky, but it might just work. He remembered hearing about a secret government facility not far from Red Creek, a place where they supposedly stored advanced technology. If he could break in and steal the parts he needed, he might be able to finish the repairs. It was a long shot, but he didn't have any other options. He explained his plan to Lyra, who nodded weakly in agreement. She was too weak to come with him, so he would have to go alone. That night, Jake set out for the facility. It was located in the middle of the desert, surrounded by high fences and armed guards. Jake had never done anything like this before, but he was determined. He waited until the guards were distracted, then slipped through a gap in the fence. He made his way to the main building, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found what he was looking for, a storage room filled with strange, futuristic technology. He quickly gathered the parts he needed, stuffing them into a backpack. But just as he was about to leave, he heard a voice behind him. "Freeze! Don't move!" Jake turned around to see a soldier pointing a gun at him. His heart sank. He was caught. But before the soldier could do anything, there was a blinding flash of light, and the soldier collapsed to the ground unconscious. Jake looked around, confused, and then he saw her, Lyra. She was standing in the doorway, her hand outstretched. Her skin was glowing faintly, and her eyes were filled with a fierce determination. She had used some kind of energy blast to knock out the soldier. "Lyra!" Jake exclaimed, rushing to her side. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be resting." Lyra shook her head, pointing to the backpack. She was telling him to go, to finish the mission. Jake hesitated, but then he nodded. They didn't have time to waste. Together, they made their way back to the garage, avoiding the guards and the security cameras. When they finally arrived, Jake immediately set to work, using the stolen parts to finish the repairs. Lyra watched him, her eyes filled with gratitude. But just as Jake was putting the final touches on the ship, he heard a noise outside. He looked out the window and saw a fleet of black SUVs pulling up to the garage. The government had found them. "Shit," Jake muttered, his heart racing. "We're out of time." Lyra grabbed his arm, her eyes filled with urgency. She pointed to the ship, then to the sky. She was telling him to get in, to leave with her. Jake hesitated. He had never imagined leaving Earth, but he knew that if he stayed, he would be arrested, or worse. And he couldn't let Lyra go alone. She needed him. "All right," he said, nodding. "Let's go." They climbed into the ship, and Jake activated the engines. The ship hummed to life, the controls lighting up. Jake had no idea how to fly it, but Lyra was there to guide him. She placed her hands on the controls, and the ship lifted off the ground, hovering in the air. But just as they were about to take off, the garage doors burst open, and a group of soldiers stormed in, their guns raised. "Stop! Don't move!" one of them shouted. Jake's heart pounded as he looked at Lyra. "What do we do?" Lyra's eyes narrowed, and she pushed the controls forward. The ship shot forward, crashing through the roof of the garage and into the night sky. The soldiers opened fire, but the ship was too fast. Within seconds, they were out of range, soaring through the atmosphere and into space. Jake stared out the window, watching as the Earth grew smaller and smaller. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He was in space, in an alien ship, with an alien by his side. It was surreal. But as they left the Earth behind, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He looked at the radar screen and saw a blip behind them. It was another ship, and it was gaining fast. "Lyra," he said, pointing to the screen. "We've got company." Lyra's eyes widened, and she quickly adjusted the controls trying to outmaneuver the other ship. But it was no use. The other ship was faster, and it was closing in. Jake's heart raced as he realized what was happening. They were being chased by the government, or maybe something worse. And if they were caught, there was no telling what would happen to them. "Hold on," Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. She pushed the controls to their limit, and the ship shot forward, faster than ever before. But it wasn't enough. The other ship was right behind them, and it was preparing to fire. Jake braced himself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, there was a blinding flash of light, and the other ship was gone. Jake looked around, confused, and then he saw it. A massive, glowing portal had opened up in front of them. Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with relief. "Home," she said, pointing to the portal. Jake's heart swelled with hope. They were going to make it. They were going to Lyra's home. But as they approached the portal, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The portal was unstable, flickering and pulsating with energy. It was dangerous, and they were flying straight into it. "Lyra," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you sure about this?" Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Trust me." Jake took a deep breath and nodded. He had come this far. He had to trust her. The ship entered the portal, and everything went white. The journey through the portal was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. It was as if they were being pulled through a tunnel of light, with colors and shapes swirling around them in a dizzying array. Jake felt a strange sensation, like his body was being stretched and compressed at the same time. It was disorienting, and he had to close his eyes to keep from getting sick. But just as quickly as it had begun, the journey was over. The ship emerged from the portal, and Jake opened his eyes to see a breathtaking sight. They were in space, but it was unlike any space he had ever seen. The stars were brighter, the colors more vivid, and in the distance, he could see a planet, Lyra's home. It was a beautiful world, with swirling clouds of blue and green, and a faint, golden glow emanating from its surface. Jake felt a sense of awe as he looked at it. This was where Lyra came from. This was her home. But their moment of peace was short-lived. The ship's alarm suddenly blared, and Jake looked at the radar screen to see that they were being pursued again. The other ship had followed them through the portal, and it was closing in fast. "Lyra," Jake said, his voice filled with urgency. "We've got to do something." Lyra's eyes narrowed, and she quickly adjusted the controls, trying to outmaneuver the other ship. But it was no use. The other ship was faster, and it was preparing to fire. Jake braced himself for the impact, but instead of firing, the other ship sent out a beam of energy that latched onto their ship, pulling them in. "They're trying to board us," Jake shouted. Lyra's eyes filled with determination, and she pushed the controls to their limit, trying to break free. But the beam was too strong. They were being pulled in, and there was nothing they could do. As the other ship drew closer, Jake could see that it was larger and more heavily armed than theirs. It was a warship, and it was clear that they were no match for it. "Lyra," Jake said, his voice filled with desperation. "What do we do?" Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We fight." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been in a situation like this before, but he knew that he had to protect Lyra. He grabbed a strange-looking weapon from the ship's armory, a sleek, silver device that Lyra had shown him earlier. It was some kind of energy gun, and he hoped it would be enough. The other ship docked with theirs, and Jake could hear the sound of boots on metal as the soldiers boarded. He and Lyra took up positions near the door, ready to defend themselves. The door burst open, and a group of soldiers stormed in, their weapons raised. Jake didn't hesitate. He fired the energy gun, and a blast of light shot out, knocking one of the soldiers to the ground. Lyra followed suit, using her own energy blasts to take out the others. But there were too many of them. More soldiers poured in, and Jake and Lyra were quickly overwhelmed. They were forced to retreat deeper into the ship, with the soldiers hot on their heels. As they ran, Jake noticed something strange. The soldiers weren't human. They were aliens, but not like Lyra. They were taller, with dark, scaly skin and glowing red eyes. They were terrifying, and Jake knew that they were in serious trouble. "Lyra," Jake said, panting as they ran. "Who are these guys?" Lyra's eyes were filled with fear. "The enemy," she said simply. Jake didn't have time to ask more questions. They reached the ship's engine room, and Lyra quickly sealed the door behind them. But it wouldn't hold for long. The soldiers were already pounding on the door, trying to break through. "Lyra," Jake said, his voice filled with desperation. "What do we do now?" Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We fight to the end." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this might be the end, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The door burst open, and the soldiers stormed in. Jake and Lyra fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Just as it seemed like all hope was lost, there was a blinding flash of light, and the soldiers were thrown back. Jake looked around, confused, and then he saw her, a figure standing in the doorway, her hand outstretched. It was another alien, but this one was different. She was tall and regal, with long, flowing hair and a glowing aura. She was beautiful, and she radiated power. The soldiers hesitated, clearly afraid of her. She spoke in a commanding voice, and the soldiers quickly retreated, leaving Jake and Lyra alone. Jake stared at the newcomer, his heart racing. "Who are you?" he asked. The alien smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "I am Lyra's mother," she said. "And you, Jake, are our savior." Jake was stunned. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing. They were safe, for now. The journey to Lyra's home planet was a blur. Jake was still reeling from the battle, and the sudden appearance of Lyra's mother had left him with more questions than answers. But as they approached the planet, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. It was even more beautiful up close, with vast oceans, lush forests, and towering mountains. The cities were unlike anything he had ever seen, with gleaming spires and floating structures that seemed to defy gravity. As they landed, Jake was greeted by a crowd of aliens, all of whom looked similar to Lyra. They were tall and graceful, with glowing skin and mesmerizing eyes. They welcomed him with open arms, treating him like a hero. It was overwhelming, but Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had saved Lyra, and now he was being honored for it. Lyra's mother, whose name was Queen Seraphina, explained everything to him. Lyra was a princess, and her people were at war with a ruthless alien race known as the Zorvax. The Zorvax had been trying to conquer their planet for years, and Lyra's mission had been to find allies who could help them in their fight. But her ship had been damaged during a skirmish, and she had crash-landed on Earth. Jake had not only saved Lyra's life, but he had also given her people hope. His bravery and ingenuity had impressed them, and they believed that he could help them win the war. Jake was hesitant at first. He was just a mechanic from a small town on Earth. He didn't know the first thing about fighting a war. But as he looked at Lyra, he knew that he couldn't say no. She had become more than just a friend to him. She was someone he cared about deeply, and he couldn't let her down. Over the next few weeks, Jake trained with Lyra's people, learning how to use their advanced technology and weapons. He was a quick learner, and soon he was leading missions against the Zorvax, using his knowledge of mechanics to outsmart them. The war was far from over, but with Jake's help, Lyra's people were starting to gain the upper hand. But as the war raged on, Jake couldn't help but think about Earth. He missed his home, his garage, and the simple life he had left behind. He knew that he couldn't stay on Lyra's planet forever, but he also knew that he couldn't leave until the war was won. Finally, after months of fighting, the tide began to turn. Jake led a daring mission to destroy the Zorvax's main base, and with the help of Lyra and her people, they succeeded. The Zorvax were defeated, and peace was restored to the planet. As the celebrations began, Jake knew that it was time for him to go home. He had done what he had set out to do, and now it was time to return to his old life. But saying goodbye to Lyra was harder than he had expected. She had become such an important part of his life, and he knew that he would miss her dearly. "Thank you, Jake," Lyra said, her eyes filled with tears. "You saved us. You saved me." Jake smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Lyra. You showed me a whole new world, and I'll never forget it." Lyra reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and comforting. "You will always have a home here, Jake. Whenever you need us, we will be here for you." Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Lyra. I'll never forget you." As Jake boarded the ship that would take him back to Earth, he couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. He was leaving behind a world that had become so important to him, and a friend who had changed his life forever. But he also knew that he had made a difference, and that was something he would always be proud of. When he finally returned to Earth, Jake found that things had changed. The government had been searching for him, and they had questions about where he had been and what he had been doing. But Jake kept Lyra secret, knowing that it was too important to share. He returned to his garage, to the life he had left behind. But he was different now. He had seen things that most people could only dream of, and he had done things that he never thought possible. He knew that he would never be the same. But as he looked up at the stars at night, he couldn't help but smile. He knew that somewhere out there, Lyra was watching over him, and that gave him a sense of peace. And who knew? Maybe one day, he would see her again.